Now, moving on to a different angle, and since Hamas's unprovoked attack on Israel, there has been an unprecedented escalation in anti-Semitism and calls for violence against Israel and Zionists. In fact, some put that percentage at, get this, over 1,000% of an increase. Now, aiding and abetting that violence is unfortunately some media coverage that refuses to call Hamas terrorists and have been quick to call out Israel over possible war crimes that, after verified and independent reports, turned out to be committed by the very terror groups in the Gaza Strip themselves. That bias then filters down into the public, who is groomed by it and buys a lot into the misinformation. Here is one such example from London.
Be free, Palestine! Hope you all have a blessed day today. Look after yourself. Give a big shout out to everybody. And keep all those people in your prayers. Have a good.
Well, joining me now from Tel Aviv is British journalist and Middle East expert Tom Grass. Tom, that tube driver has since been suspended, but my question is, do people actually realize when they chant Free Palestine that they should probably add to that from Hamas and other terror groups, or that From the River to the Sea chant literally calls for the genocide of all Jews, and in that sense, possibly even Arab Israelis who make up part of the population in this country as well?
Well, it's hard to say whether everyone making the chant From the River to the Sea quite understands what's involved, but certainly informed people do. Certainly academics or BBC reporters understand exactly that chant is for the eradication of Israel. They would not chant for the eradication of any other country on earth. I mean, it's genocidal. So I think that, you know, the BBC is the national institution in Britain, and not only Britain, it broadcasts in dozens of languages across the world to tens of millions of people using taxpayers' money to do so, is definitely inflaming not just hatred of Israel, but blatant anti-Semitism. It's gone way beyond its remit as a broadcaster, both in the content, but also in the omission of what they say. Can I just provide one example? For example, on the question of the hospital that was bombed, that was rocketed by Islamic Jihad, I said to a BBC reporter I know, you do realize that Hamas hit a hospital in Israel a day after October 7th. They hit the Barzilai hospital in the southern city of Ashkelon, damaging the hospital. The day after, they injured a nurse from India in Ashkelon. And the BBC reporter just said, I don't care. I mean, it's blatant prejudice. They certainly are aware of what information they are selecting to give and what they are selecting to not give.
Absolutely. I just want to point out to our viewers that there are rocket sirens that are sounding in the Gaza border communities. Again, we did see a lull almost this morning, but in the last couple of hours, there have been barrages being shot from the Gaza Strip into Israel. And as you mentioned, there is this question of whether we're talking about unconscious bias or simply just blatant Jew hatred and anti-Semitism. And as you mentioned, with regards to that Gaza hospital blast, the BBC admitted that it made mistakes in its coverage, and yet it still won't call Hamas terrorists. Why? How can the possible raping, beheading, and burning of not just IDF officials, but also women, children, the elderly, be considered anything else? Militants don't do that, and neither do freedom fighters.
Well, the BBC claimed that they don't use the word terrorist in other conflicts, but that is not correct. Just this past few days, 2 Swedish soccer fans were shot dead by an Islamist gunman when they went to a match in Belgium, and the BBC used the word terrorist about that incident. I should also point out, they've then said to me when I've asked them, well, we don't use it in the Middle East, just in Europe. And I said, well, you know, when your own correspondent, Frank Gardner, was injured in an attack in Saudi Arabia some years ago, he was injured in an Al-Qaeda attack, the BBC called that terrorism. So you do use it in a Middle East conflict contest. So they are very disingenuous in their use of language. But I'd like to say there's been a lot of people talking about the use of the word terrorist. I think there's a bigger problem than that, and that is just the misinformation. So you constantly have on screen on BBC a figure for civilian death toll in Gaza without explaining that this figure is provided by Hamas, is totally unreliable, almost certainly exaggerated. So of course the ordinary person, the ordinary viewer is going to think, well, of course we sympathize with the Palestinians. Of course Israel isn't taking enough care to avoid civilian casualties if thousands of civilians have been killed by Israeli airstrikes in the last 2 weeks. And I would say we have no evidence whatsoever that thousands of civilians have been killed other than Hamas's claims. And we know perfectly well that Hamas is unreliable. And the BBC in other conflicts would not, for example, take ISIS's figures or Al-Qaeda's figures and just broadcasting them without even mentioning the only people saying them are ISIS or Al-Qaeda.
I think it is important to mention that with those figures coming out of the Hamas-run health ministry and other Palestinian authorities in the Gaza Strip, that there is no distinction being made between the Hamas terrorists that are being targeted and killed versus the innocent civilians that happen to be in harm's way because they are used as human shields. Now, with that being said, it's also important to note that while criticism on the BBC is increasing and evidently rightly so, it is not all BBC journalists, because there have been countless journalists that have resigned from their positions or come on air to personally either apologize or admit into their mistakes. And we're also seeing that sort of flowing now into a lot of other international media, for example, CNN. There's a lot of liberal or genuinely progressive journalists and anchors that tend to now be questioning a lot of the people that they normally bring on that are pro-Palestinian voices. And so important to note that there is somewhat a shift, but also that there is this mainstream narrative against Israel.
Well, I'm not sure I share that assessment. I watch the media a lot from all kinds of stations, and I have not seen a lot of people come on. They've been former BBC staffers, when it's too late now, criticise the organisation they're no longer working for, including the previous head of BBC Television has written articles for the Daily Telegraph in London criticising the organisation. But I'm not suggesting they're not, by the way, fair reporters at the BBC. Of course, some of them are fair, but overall, no. I don't think they've apologised at all or gone back at all. I'd also say, since you mentioned figures, that even the hospital incident rocketing in Gaza, which hit a car park of the hospital, not the hospital, there's no evidence at all that more than 20, 30 fatalities happened. That's what European intelligence agencies say. So they're still reporting it as hundreds of casualties. There is a kind of misunderstanding that Israel is scrupulous about its information. Even now, they're counting one by one to identify bodies, not to exaggerate. The number of hostages, for example, is probably higher than the official figure, but they don't want to exaggerate. Whereas on the other side, we have an entirely unreliable organization. We don't believe everything that, I don't know, Vladimir Putin says. We don't believe what North Korea says. Why should we believe what Hamas says about numbers of figures? I'd also just point out about anti-Semitism. A lot of it is subconscious. So there was a famous phrase about the Germans after the Holocaust by an Israeli psychoanalyst who said, with great irony, the Germans will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz. So I would say the BBC will never forgive Israel for not bombing a hospital. They want Israel to behave badly so they can then say, look at that terrible Israeli state that we should delegitimize.
I think even without behaving badly, Tom Gross, if I may be so bold to say that unconscious bias tends to seep through even without Israel giving them due cause. I want to thank you so very much, British journalist and Middle East expert Tom Gross, for joining us today.